Hello, my name is Darren Bradley. Welcome to my talk, The Role of Cognitive Affordances in World Building for Video Games. Part one. This is actually going to be a sequence of small videos that you can piece together for the full conversation about affordances. I work as a visiting assistant professor at the University of North Texas in the United States, where I teach narrative design and script writing for video games. I'm joined today by my cat, Nunchucks, who could not be bothered to vacate the study. So if you'll please give him a nice warm welcome as well, I'd appreciate it. I'm thrilled to be a part of the workshop Embodying Space and Hypertext Fiction through Psychogeography, and I hope that we can have a really productive conversation today. So the reason that this conversation happens in pieces is because to talk about affordances in world building for video games, we have to have a few smaller conversations first. So let me bring up my screen real quick. And it is loading. All right, you should not be able to see my presentation. So before we really get any further, we have to talk about narrative design versus script writing. And fundamental to those two ideas is this notion of interdisciplinarity. So in the world of writing for video games or doing narrative design, there is no such distinction between academic disciplines. This process borrows from everything: history, geography, psychology, anything that could possibly benefit the building of a narrative world in a simulated reality like a video game is fair game. So narrative designers steal from everything. In this thought experiment today, we're going to borrow from a few different disciplines. And as we go, I'm going to include some titles that you'll see on your screen for additional reading if you'd like to know more. This is really just meant to be an introduction. So as narrative designers, it benefits us to broaden the scope of our skills beyond just what we think of as script writing. That's usually how we envision the idea of writing for video games, writing scripts that look really similar to scripts for movies. But that's only the tail end of the process. After all, we are simulating entire human beings when we create player characters, so we need to do more than just tell a story in a script. So the primary differences between narrative design and game writing have to do with which stage of the process they represent. So game writing or script writing is technically a part of narrative design. So they might often be two different positions, two different people, but they can also be rolled into just one. So one role can take care of both. A narrative designer, as you can see on your screen, is responsible for how the story is told. So that means things like what methods are we going to use, how much time is available to us in the development process for cutscenes and for narrative development. How many characters are we allowed to write in? Because each one of those has to be animated, and that costs money, and it requires developers' time from other parts of the team. A game writer, on the other hand, is responsible for the actual writing of the story. That means dialogue, that means the unfolding of the plot lines, that means callouts from NPCs. Anything that has to help fill out the narrative design is the job of the game writer. And as I said, narrative design might just be the first stage, but can also be a dedicated ongoing role that oversees game writing as it unfolds. So this brings us a bit to our interdisciplinarity. We're going to talk a little bit about fabula and sujet. Now, some of you might be familiar with this from courses in literary studies, but if not, we're going to have just a real quick lesson here. The idea comes originally from the Russian formalism school of literary criticism, but it has been borrowed and adapted by narratologists, which is one of the disciplines we're borrowing from. These are academics who study how narratives develop and how they affect human perception. The reason this is important to us is that stories are made up of bits and pieces of a longer series of interconnected events. For example, when you watch a movie that's, let's say, 2 hours long, it often represents a time period that's much longer than that, perhaps months or even years. But in order to actually have transcribed that story, you would have to watch a movie that is months or years long. Obviously, that's not possible. So instead, we use bits and pieces, and we basically are cheating the rule of the idea of dependent origination, which is that everything in determinist theory, everything is the result of something else. So every decision you make, every turn you take, every step you take is influenced by what came immediately before that. So in a story, though, we rarely get all of those specific causal details. We only get a few that service the narrative. So instead, we need to rearrange them, abbreviate them, and gather them into the story. The way that you can think of it is the fabula is the actual chronology of events that is recreated into the sujet. So if the actual storyline took a year to play out, that's your fabula, then the version that you get to witness either as a book or as a film or as a video game, the shorter version, that's the sujet. So that brings us to the idea of simulations and extended selfhood. Now we're borrowing from cognitive psychology, and you can see in the bottom left corner of your screen, there's some recommended reading if you'd like to look into this a little bit further. Video games, unlike novels or other forms of fiction, are simulating selves because they're creating identities that players can assume, not just witness, right? The idea is that we temporarily suspend our own sense of being, and we create a new one based on prompts from game designers and writers. We become the character. So we can look to cognitive theory for a really easy explanation for how this works. We tend to think of selfhood as contained in our brains and in our bodies, but we're actually capable of extending this kind of awareness beyond, based on sensory perception, almost like the way that bats use echolocation. Let me give you an example. If you're driving in your car and you hit a pothole and it makes you wince, you have extended your sense of self to include your entire car. After all, you're in no danger of any harm from the pothole, but it might feel like something had happened to the car that makes you, regret the situation. That is an extended self. So when you include an environment larger than this part of you, your extended self, then you are having a larger lived experience. And that's how we project our identities into the characters in a video game. That brings us to the importance of time. So we can think of it in three different ways: experiential time, anachrony, and recursion. There are longer explanations for you on the screen there, but time is experiential in the sense that it unfolds for all of us at different paces based on where we are in our lives and what we're doing. So that means, kind of like water or electricity, it's following a path of least resistance. That's good for us as narrative designers and scriptwriters because that means we can manipulate its passage. We can control it. That's what limiters and things like this are for. Anachrony, again from narratology, is one of our primary tools for hacking time like this. It's a narratological device that refers back to the fabula and the sujet, those big and small stories. When the elements of the sujet, the chopped up, mixed up short version, appear out of order, we call that an anachrony. More importantly is the idea of recursion. So the way that we think as people is very recursive. Every day, our minds flash forward, they flash back, we think in fragments, we create speculations, we dream, we exist in loops. In fact, as you're listening to this video, your mind is going to wander to other places than just what I'm talking about. That's completely normal. That's how we orient and navigate in our world. Recursion is the process of looping back to familiar concepts over and over anytime throughout the day to orient how we live our daily lives. And we're going to use this. Excuse me one moment. So now we're starting to talk about cognitive game design in action. So how do all of these weird things work and play into game design? Well, remember first that you're doing more than just telling a story when you write a script. You're creating a simulated consciousness into which we can extend our awarenesses and our perspectives to change how we're experiencing our daily lives. To keep a player engaged in the story, the game needs to offer a conscious experience that's similar to everyday thinking and being. So if we think in loops, if we think in flashbacks, if we think in flash forwards, we need to recreate that in the narrative experience in order to make the simulated selfhood, the simulated consciousness, feel more real. When we use those tools in reverse, our game ends up, in a sense, playing the player rather than the player playing it, because it is making the player think in a particular fashion in a way that it wants it to work. Now, recursion, I said a moment ago, was important because that's how we think. In games, this is a methodological approach. So when we return to memories, ideas, or speculate about the future, this is how we build interactive complexity. For example, when you execute certain combinations on your controller, movements, techniques, or sequences over and over, you stop cognitively thinking about them as you play. They become something that you just do almost instinctually. And it creates a sort of shorthand that hacks time and collapses it in order to shorten how long it takes to do something. So let me give you an example. If in the real world you wanted to do a backflip, you have to stand up, you have to prepare yourself, get your balance, and then execute the flip itself, which may take a couple of seconds. Who knows? In a video game, if you want to do a backflip, all you have to do is push one button and the backflip occurs. So I have compacted the amount of thought and energy and action that's necessary to actively simulate what's going on in a real world. I'm hacking time, basically. I'm reducing its resistance to passage, which is what makes games engaging in the first place. Recursion allows us to do this at any time that we want during a game, and it also allows us to come back to sequences over and over that help us build the world, which is our main topic of conversation, without using a bunch of exposition. So simulation, the idea of simulating a person, how do we bring that practically into a game? Well, when we use nil spaces, which are kind of like little worlds that don't exist, we can explore the game world without necessarily disrupting the storyline. And by that, I mean, if you were to slow down time, let's say, to demonstrate how in a video game a weapon works or how you do a sequence of movements, right? You are allowing the player to explore the actual world. And this has to do with affordances, which we'll talk about in a little while, without interrupting their engagement with the narrative. You're not forcing them to watch these cutscenes that can slow things down. This kind of metagaming avoids the need for artificial sequences. If you're a gamer or fond of video games, you might share the frustration of really long training sequences that sometimes keep us from getting into the game really quickly. Those can be really boring and kind of off-putting. If instead we use little pockets of nil space time in order to learn things as we go, we can avoid that altogether and increase player engagement. So back to experiential time, this topic and anachrony help us tell the story as we go rather than passively receiving one, which is kind of what happens when we're reading a book or watching a film. So when we begin a game, we do not have the character's full bank of memories. We do not have the full timeline of dependent origination of events causing events causing events that led to the state of the player at this point of the story. So the standard practice to fix this is to use in-game artifacts to fill in that backstory. Things to read, documents to look at, videos to watch. But these are time consuming and they can be boring and can damage our attention span. They slow down the passage of time without any immediate reward. For example, if I slow down the passage of time to show you how a new tool works in a game, well, at the end of that experience, you now have this tool and you know how to use it. You've gotten a reward. And a game is nothing but a system of operations with a reward at the end. Whatever game you're thinking of, video games, tabletop games, playing games with your friends. However, if we do this just to tell a backstory, there is no reward to take away from it, like learning how to use a new tool. So if we instead use flashbacks and nil spaces that are playable, that allow you to work your way through the memory or the backstory or what have you as it unfolds, we're allowing this to be more experiential without slowing down experiential time. So, excuse me one moment, I stop the share. All right, that is our introduction to these affordances. We're going to break here and move on to our next session where I hope you'll join me very quickly. Thank you.